If you think the energy crisis is still somewhere out there, happening far away in oil fields and shipping lanes, it's not. It's already moving downstream, and it's getting closer to everyday life faster than most people realize. Yesterday, we focused on the supply side, production, exports, disruptions coming out of Russia and Iran. That situation is already bad, and it's still deteriorating. But what really matters now is what happens next, when those upstream shocks start hitting consumers directly, and we're now entering that phase. We're 5 weeks into this disruption, and the numbers are staggering. Roughly 500 million barrels of crude oil that should have reached global markets simply didn't. That's not a small imbalance, that's a massive hole in supply. The last shipments that were loaded before the conflict began have already reached Asia, and Europe is just now receiving its final pre-war deliveries. After that, the buffer is gone. And from next week onward, a second wave begins. The ongoing disruption of Russian exports, particularly what's being targeted and interrupted, starts to hit Europe in a real measurable way. In other words, what Asia has already been dealing with is about to spread west, but the impact isn't uniform. Every region is reacting differently depending on how their energy systems are built. Asia is already deep in the stress phase. Rationing is no longer theoretical, it's happening. In some places, governments are controlling distribution. In others, informal markets are emerging to fill the gaps. When official supply chains break down, people improvise, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Take India as an example. They've managed to avoid a full-scale oil crisis so far, largely because they've been absorbing whatever limited crude is still available, including Russian supply that has effectively been reintroduced into the system. That has kept their industrial and transportation sectors functioning. But energy isn't just about gasoline and diesel. For a huge portion of the population, daily life depends on liquefied petroleum gas, propane, used for cooking, and that supply has historically come almost entirely from the Persian Gulf. That flow has now collapsed. So while cars may still be running, millions of households are facing a completely different kind of energy shortage, one that hits at the most basic level. And India isn't alone. Across the region, New Zealand, Thailand, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, the story is similar, just at different intensities. Some are rationing fuel, others are dealing with partial shortages. But the direction is the same everywhere: tightening supply and rising pressure. Then there's South Korea. If you're looking for the country that's most exposed right now, this is it. It's a major industrial economy with very limited energy flexibility. They don't have many alternative sources, and they rely heavily on imports. That combination makes them extremely vulnerable, and the concern there is growing fast. Japan, on the other hand, is in a slightly better position, at least for now. They have access to suppliers from the Western Hemisphere, and just as importantly, they have the naval capability to secure those routes if necessary. That gives them a buffer that others in the region simply don't have. China is a special case. They are absolutely experiencing shortages. Make no mistake about that, but their system was built differently. Over the past years, China invested heavily in refining capacity far beyond domestic needs. Their model was simple: import crude, process it, and export refined fuel. Now in a crisis, that overcapacity becomes a strategic advantage. Instead of exporting fuel, they've shut those exports down and redirected supply inward. That decision is what's keeping their domestic system relatively stable. But stability in one place creates instability elsewhere. Countries that relied on Chinese refined fuel, like Australia and New Zealand, are suddenly cut off. So even though China is holding the line internally, it's exporting the problem to others by removing a key source of supply from the global market. And this is how the crisis spreads. Not just through shortages, but through shifting dependencies. Europe is next in line, but they're slightly behind in the timeline. The final pre-war shipments have just arrived, so the real strain is only beginning now. For the moment, they still have some breathing room, but that window is closing quickly. There's a workaround system that Europe has been relying on, in a kind of indirect pipeline. Since direct purchases of Russian crude are restricted, the oil gets shipped elsewhere, refined in third countries, and then sent back to Europe as finished products. It's a workaround that kept supply flowing despite the restrictions. That system is now starting to break. Within 2 to 3 weeks, that workaround collapses under the weight of the broader disruption. And when it does, Russian energy effectively disappears from Europe's equation. At the same time, Persian Gulf supply is no longer reliable either. When both of those pillars drop out simultaneously, you're not looking at a shortage, you're looking at a full-scale structural crisis. Meanwhile, something interesting is happening in the Persian Gulf itself. Ship traffic is starting to pick up slightly, about 20 to 30 vessels per day over the weekend. That sounds like a recovery, but in reality, it's only about 15% of normal pre-war levels, and the way those ships are moving tells you everything about the situation. Previously, Iran established a system in the Strait of Hormuz where vessels were effectively paying a fee, around $2 million for safe passage through the northern route. It was less about formal policy and more about controlled movement under pressure. Now, Oman, which controls the southern side of the strait, is implementing a similar approach. Ships are reflagging, changing their identification, presenting themselves as Omani-linked vessels to reduce the risk of being targeted. Oman has always played a balancing role in the region, not fully aligned with the US-backed Gulf states, and not fully in Iran's camp either. That neutrality is now being used as a kind of shield. So far, Iranian forces have avoided targeting these vessels, but that doesn't make the route safe. It just makes it possible. And here's the critical detail. Ships are leaving the Gulf, but almost none are going in. That imbalance matters more than anything else. Out of the hundreds of vessels that were trapped in the region earlier, some are escaping, but replacements aren't arriving. The flow is one-directional, which means even if oil production continues, even if facilities are intact, the system is effectively broken, because there's no way to move the oil to market. And then there's the political layer on top of all of this. One of the most significant and overlooked consequences of this conflict is what's happened to sanctions. The framework that was built over years to isolate Russian and Iranian oil has effectively been dismantled. Restrictions on purchasing oil that's already in transit have been lifted. That single decision has undone years of economic pressure. 4 to 5 years in the case of Russia, and more than a decade for Iran. Think about that for a second. Years of coordinated policy designed to squeeze these economies, wiped out almost overnight. If the US or its allies want to rebuild that system, they won't be able to just flip a switch. They'll have to start over from the beginning. And yes, there are still physical disruptions, damaged infrastructure, interrupted logistics, especially on the Russian side. Those factors are still very real and still very damaging. But the bigger picture is this: in the middle of a war, the rules of the energy market have been rewritten, and the irony is hard to ignore. It took a conflict initiated by the United States to bring Iranian oil back into the legal global system. That's not just a market shift, that's a complete reset of how energy, politics, and power interact on the world stage. And we're only at the beginning of what that reset is going to look like.